Alright. 3, 2, 1 തുടങ്ങാം.
And welcome to Hitchens Razor, yet another episode. And we are in the continuation of Ideologies Part 2. So I'd let Vinod carry on from the previous episode, and let's just get straight into it. Go ahead, Vinod.
On the morning of 14th July 1789, a crowd of Parisian workers set out to attack the royal prison of the Bastille. Joined by the deserting soldiers who brought cannons and ignored by the royal army troops camped nearby, the crowds forced their way into the fortress by late afternoon, killing the governor and parading his head on a pike. That evening, King Louis XVI reportedly asked the Duke, "Is this a revolt?" To which the Duke replied, "No, sire, it is a revolution." This sentence, or this paragraph, is from J.A. Goldstein's book. And with that, welcome to the second part of Political Ideologies. In this episode, we discuss French Revolution. Well, why are we still talking about the French Revolution? It is unique, and indeed it is timeless, isn't it? It's loaded and laden with all flavors of humanity, its past, its present, and possibly its future. And it has its catchy narrative, which is euphemistic to the popular movies where the dormant hero, who when goaded pretty hard, rises to react. And we will not delve deep into the details of it as much as I would like, but certainly we will attempt to present a solid summary of the event. And then we'll move on to ask the question, why did it happen? And finally, we'll try to connect the answer to the topic at hand, political ideologies. Welcome to Hitchens Razor.
Yep, and it's probably the only revolution that stood the test of time. And the only revolution probably that was worthwhile, because it still has its spillover effects on the current state of political affairs. The only thing that probably comes closer is the Bolshevik Revolution, but then it died down, and it's not as relevant. But something so fascinating about the French Revolution is that it's still so relevant even to this day. And it's probably the only revolution that's been able to do this. It's very fascinating.
Right. I think, probably we should give a small recap of what we discussed in the first episode. The first episode, we were building up to French Revolution, which meant the history from the point where we were hunter-gatherers and all the way to the 18th century, where we passed through the feudal system, the rise of bourgeoisie, and the 3 R's, the Reformation, Renaissance, and finally the last R, which is the revolution where we are at now. We also discussed about American Revolution and the happenings in England, Netherlands, and Switzerland before the French Revolution. So again, this I have to do. I apologize, like Vishnu did last time, for all the wrong pronunciations in this episode. There are so many foreign words. English itself is a bit foreign, so even my English might have bad pronunciations, to which I can only say I'm sorry. And we are grateful to the following authors for their great work on the topic, which has helped us immensely to tell this story. I'll list the names down. William Doyle, The French Revolution. It's a very short introduction published by Oxford University Press. Jawaharlal Nehru's Glimpses of the World History. Jack Goldstone's Revolutions. It's a very short introduction to the revolutions published by Oxford University Press. And I don't think I can get the name right, but George Lefebvre, The French Revolution, and it's translated to English by Elizabeth Moss Evanson.
His last name sounds like cheese. Like French, like popular French cheese. But then everything French sounds like cheese. So,
No, but again, it's my pronunciation, so I don't know if that's the right one. Did you know this pronunciation has nothing to do with pronoun, rather it has everything to do with enunciate or enunciation. That's the
so then why is
etymology
it?
of that word.
Oh,
Yeah, it's
really? And is it not
pro-enunciation.
etymology? And is it etymology, not
It's
epistemology?
etymology, yeah.
Yeah.
I
So
wonder
why
what's
do they have
the...
pronoun?
Don't know. That's something else apparently.
Right.
I think... yeah, this has to do with enunciation. Anyway, we digress. I'll get back to... let's get back to French Revolution, yeah. I was about to ask what is the etymology of the word etymology, but let's leave etymologyception for a later episode, and then let's focus on French Revolution, shall we?
Yeah.
In the 17th and 18th century, that's where our story is happening, France's attempt to remain a global superpower meant waging war with Prussia, Russia, and Britain. And this happened all over the world. Sorry?
Like everyone, basically. Like attack your neighborhood, attack whomever you see, and then
Yeah, and this happened all over the world, in Canada, India, and native Europe, at both the land and the sea. And because remember, by then Europeans had developed an insatiable appetite for tropical and oriental luxuries. Cotton, sugar, slaves. Well, no.
I was just going to add it for that. Yeah.
Now, engaging in relentless war meant destruction, and destruction called for rebuilding. Well, rebuilding cost money. During hard times, money demands either financial discipline or, bankruptcy. For France, it was the latter. And also the recent crop failure meant inflation, and the bread prices started to rise. So that's the beginning. And at the verge of bankruptcy, the monarch Louis XVI proposed new taxes to raise funds, naturally. But it was rejected by the courts or the parliaments of the ancient regime in France. The members of the parliaments were aristocrats who had bought or inherited their offices and the privilege that came with it. And they were sort of independent from the king. And the king had tried to get rid of them at some point because they've become an obstacle for the king to get his way. But seeking a solution to this problem, the king called for a meeting with the representatives of the three estates of the realm. The French society, back then, it was classified into the clergy, the nobles, and the third estate. The third estate is everyone else. And clergy is the god people, and nobles are the rich and powerful and the privileged, yeah. Now, the third estate consisted much of bourgeoisie. We had discussed at length about bourgeoisie in the last episode. And the third estate, they refused the proposed taxes because its burden fell disproportionately on their thin shoulders when compared to the clergy and the nobles. The clergy and the nobles, on the other hand, they wanted to vote on this matter, but since the estates generals voted by order than by heads, it meant any two estates could outvote a third. When I say the taxes fell disproportionately on the third estate, there is a whole episode that we can do on the loopholes and the way how the tax system worked and how it benefited the top two classes.
Or how it still does. Like to a reasonable extent. Not as bad as the French Revolution, but yeah.
No, I guess it has. I don't know if we have that split again anymore, but there are loopholes definitely, but not systematic at least.
Yeah, not systematic. Yes, for sure.
Right. So when the Estates General met on the 5th May of 1789, the Third Estate demanded that all three categories be merged and the voting shall be done by heads instead of order. And as you can imagine, the motion was rejected. Now, there were some attempts to appease to the third estate by doubling the numbers and everything, but ultimately it didn't work out. There's much story between what we have capsuled into this narrative than what actually happened. So yeah, that's there. Just a second, I heard a ring, so I'll try to silence my phone. Yes, done. The third estate, they rejected the whole proposal. The deadlock went for a few weeks while the bread prices steadily were increasing, and also the public order now was being compromised sporadically at different places. And so finally the third estate decided to disband from the realm and go solo. So some members of the other order jumped ship and joined the third estate, which now obviously could not be called the third estate anymore. So they found a new name, which is called the National Assembly. The National Assembly were not allowed to meet in their usual place, so they convened in a tennis court nearby and took an oath to give France a constitution with
why a tennis
much
court?
Equality. Sorry?
Why a tennis court?
I think that was available and then spacious enough for them. I don't know.
Logistical issues during a revolution.
and not that I don't hope the third estate were rather fond of tennis instead of football or anything else.
And the irony that tennis still remains like a rich man's game, right? Like it's a very aristocratic sport, apparently.
Is it? I don't know, to be fair. I think it has limited space. That's what's ironic, I think, because, a football stadium would have
Wimbledon's
much...
and everything. You have all the royalty and all that jazz.
Right. Yeah, get it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they took an oath in the tennis court nearby to give France a constitution. This is called the Oath of Tennis Court. No surprises there. But what this meant was... Now that's interesting. I think there is one interesting quote from William Doyle's book. The National Assembly had seized the sovereign power in the name of France's nation. It was the founding act of the French Revolution. If the nation was sovereign, then the king no longer was. So I think this is the starting point of it, where they decided to give France a constitution. That becomes a different kind of sovereign nation. And the king thought he should react to this social hullabaloo, and then his reaction drove the rest of the cat-on-the-wall clergy and noble separatists to join the National Assembly. More political unrest, bread prices still rising, and suddenly the capital city was filled with 20,000 soldiers, and much of them were foreign mercenary troops.
So it was not a coup. It was not a coup. It was, when you say foreign, like... It was
this is the reaction by the king. So he had brought in soldiers to control Paris. Now again, Paris was the epicenter of all this, where the king, I think, rested in Versailles or something. So anyway, there was 20,000 soldiers there, and when a German troop tried to disperse a crowd in Paris, the hungry citizens decided to act, and the French guards and the military decided to help the people. There was an appeal made, I think, and instead of, they didn't turn against their own people, so that could be considered a coup. And the revolutionaries, they started ransacking the strong points in the city for guns and food, and they stormed into a prison, releasing its inmates and brutally killing the guard commander who had earlier ordered to fire on them. And the taking of Bastille was complete. And that was the fall of Bastille. And
that was the first domino, basically. That started the revolution.
Yes, but to be fair, in what we are trying to look at in the podcast is, we might see that as the beginning, that as the end of the beginning of French Revolution. Because people think it was brewing from quite a long time ago. So it caught fire then probably, but there was definitely smoke.
Yeah.
That you could see.
Like you said, the prelude to war was always like inflation,
Yeah.
bread prices. There are economic reasons to.
Yeah. And like we
that
said, the
started
rise of
appealing.
bourgeoisie is one, then the reformation of the church is another
Hmm.
one where, people start thinking differently. And then there is this bit of the change in social thought. Yeah. And that's where we'll be discussing about Voltaire and
Yes.
Rousseau
Yes.
and Montesquieu in the next episode, and how the American Revolution helped and how the changes in England helped, all those. So the first one is called the bourgeoisie revolution. That's what the first part of it's called, and it's all culminated in the fall of Bastille.
So this perfect storm has many elements because it's too perfect a storm. So it's got to have it's got to have multiple components involved.
Yeah, that's one thing that we need to remember, is none of these things happened overnight. For instance, the convocation of Estates General was in fact proclaimed in mid 1788. That was a year before. Yeah. But I think even the revolution, some people, scholars, they think it officially kicked off a year. No, I mean, the revolution, obviously, the fire kicked off a year later. But some people think that the crisis actually began a year earlier when the Estates General was announced. That is, in 1787 is when they think the crisis started to brew.
Officially started. Okay.
You can't say it's official, because it's sort of blended into the workings of society then. Whereas something as rash and radical as storming of Bastille can be pointed out as
considered.
Yeah. Right.
Well, how many people died?
It's funny because the Bastille prison, right? It had only 7 inmates when it was taken. Yeah. so it's that's why I said the quote, the National Assembly, when they seized the sovereign power, it was in the name of the nation, the France nation, not in the name of the king.
Correct.
Which means that's the founding act, which means that if the nation was sovereign, then the king no longer was. And there's also the 7 inmates in there. What does this mean? This means it's a symbol of the fall of royal power and pride. And
so it's not about the number of people. It's about taking hold of an institution.
Which
is like
Now, how I have put it is, it's a symbol of the fall of royal power and pride, and also it's a release of new ideas. Pun intended. And anyway,
it's like how we say, right? It's like a group of protesters took over a police station. I mean, not a single policeman would have been injured, but the idea that they took over a police station means something, because it's a legitimate capturing of an institution. Yeah.
It turned bloody after that, but we'll come to that. I mean, the revolution, not the police station capture.
For sure.
Let's talk about the Great Revolution. So the bourgeoisie revolution, when it was over, then came the popular revolution, I think. It is called the politics of social antagonism, which started in Paris, have had now spread to the countryside. And like I said, till now, even the National Assembly, the members were all from the bourgeoisie level. And then there were peasants still struggling to live. Right. So that's much in the countryside. And there was this, the whole feeling which later transcended into paranoia of loss and fear on both sides. As in, there was this nobles or the aristocrats or, people who had the fear of losing things, or the other side which had fear of everything. Because it was such
chaos in
chaos. It's such
close to state of anarchy.
And it's much of his mind game. So you hear news, you hear things. Now when you start to react, and then who is pelting the first stone, and then it all begins, and then hell breaks loose. But anyway, that's called the popular revolution, which happened later. Meanwhile, I think the National Assembly was still working on its promises that they made in the tennis court. which is specifically to work on a constitution, and even more specifically, they were working on a preamble to the constitution, and it was called Rights of Man, which obviously we are all very familiar with. And when it was finally made public, it was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. We will get to that later. Now, it is intentional that I am omitting all the big names here. I mean, I have mentioned the king, but certainly there are names you would be interested to know, which are really prominent, obviously. But for me, we are trying to link this to the ideologies, the political ideologies.
Yes.
So I will now summarize some of the interesting events of during the French Revolution after the fall of Bastille. So the popular revolution, and then we had the abolition of privileges, and then there was this is called the October Days again. There were when women marched to Versailles to escort the king back to Paris. This is I think this is very interesting. It was all women who went to Versailles into the king's palace and then escorted him back to the epicenter of things, the capital city, the Paris. So that's something interesting happened. And then the church's property was nationalized. Remember in the last episode, feudal system, we told at the top there was Pope and church who controlled and owned large portion of land, and so they were at the top of a feudal system as well, which was part of the ancient regime, which was then status quo in France. Which was, so the church property was nationalized, nobility abolished, parliament abolished. There was a civil constitution for church, and I think this is very, very interesting because you remember how we spoke about the split between Catholics and Protestants.
Yes.
And now you listen to the sentence, there was a civil constitution made for church.
Yeah.
Which means they are also put on the same level, and the people were for it, which means, as I said, the printing and reading, everything had played a part, and they could read things, and they could see through the lies of priests and who were claimed to be the messengers of God, if not God themselves. Then there was war with the neighbors again. That's never ending. They somehow find it endlessly refreshing to go to war with neighbors
but it's quite interesting. Right? Like, why didn't all these? Were there any wars during the revolution when they knew that French was the French were in a period of internal unrest? Did any of these guys tried like invade them, attack them, like? I mean,
see, that happened a bit later. The neighboring countries, they were quite apprehensive of the fact that this might happen to their country as well.
Right.
So later, they all, I think, moved against the revolution in France. And now I don't have enough details to discuss that, but that probably is an interesting topic for another episode. We might keep it. I think we should probably do a long form version of French Revolution itself. But that's a valid question. There was retribution.
Quite true. Yeah. But
then there is
like
this.
Vinod said, this is a very interesting topic. It's not something that just the both of us, don't want to deep dive into. Like, because the idea, even for ideologies, because there's one thing that's so interesting about history, and the reason why we talk about history as much as we do is because people like Karl Marx or a Lenin might come and go, like we might not even remember details of what they did or how they lived, but their ideas still live on. You might not know it might be in plain sight, but those ideas of revolutions actually still live on. And you might be for those ideas of what Marx stood, or like me against those ideas of what Marx stood by, but unless you understand the time period and the events that led to it, we would never know what that ideology is. And that's the reason why we do want to deep dive into such historical events, even though it might be a tad bit boring or like uninteresting for a lot of listeners. But it's very important to gain context of such events.
Yeah, to quote P.G. Woodhouse, there is in one of his books where he says that he compares this to something else. I think it was Women or Love or something, where he said it's like one of those American cocktails which imperceptibly it imperceptibly goes into your system, and then it changes into a different person altogether, and you want to punch that big lad in the corner on your way to home. So ideologies are like that. As you know, it lives on, and then it creeps imperceptibly into your system. Anyway, right. So that's war, and then the famous cry, liberty, fraternity, and then the monarch. The monarch executed in 1793, and the monarch is obviously the king.
Out came the guillotines.
Yeah. Then I think the next name should remind you of guillotines, Robespierre, and then all the massacres. And I'll end this talk about French Revolution with the last name. Starts with N and also ends with N. Can you guess?
No.
Napoleon came after that.
I was thinking Napoleon, but I was thinking Napoleon Bonaparte, and then I was like, there is an E in the end of his name. Like what?
Oh yeah, sorry. I only thought of one person.
But then,
anyway,
you don't have to apologize, because his name is as big that first name basis is enough. You don't need Bonaparte. Like, which Napoleon? You don't need his last name. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like I said, we have enough content for another whole series. But we must stop now and try to identify the links to political ideology, which is the topic at hand.
Yes.
So why? Why? It's rather a curious an observation that revolutions occur more in middle-income countries than in the very, very poorest of nations. In fact, French Revolution happened when the peasants in France were better off than the peasants in Russia. So... It seems that revolutions happen when a significant proportion or significant portions of the elites, and especially the military defect and stand aside instead of defending the regime. So that seems to have happened in France as well. So the other question is, what causes revolutions? For me, I would ask what keeps the societies in a stable order. Stable condition. What makes a society resilient? In a stable society, the economic cycle turns smoothly. The economic wheel turns smoothly. People produce, earn, pay taxes, and still they have sufficient income left to support themselves and their families, and also engage in some sort of luxuries. And the taxes paid by the populace reach the ruler, who distributes it for various purposes. One of them back then was protection of its own people from the raiders,
external
other countries' external factors. This sort of keeps the equilibrium by the institutions of the land, the bureaucracy, the military, the religion, etc. Yeah. Yeah. So what causes this inequilibrium then? What causes it? According to Goldstone, here are some reasons: demographic changes, international relations, economic growth, inequality, discrimination, personalist regimes. So why did France fail then? Though the consensus is rather stable at the inexplicable nature of the causation of French Revolution, or probably too many reasons. But from our previous episode, there was a point I tried to empathize with the common people of France in the 18th century. See, the masses, they had to pay taxes, both direct and indirect, and then they literally had to pay for their own oppression. So,
taxes causes wars or revolutions, rather.
Yeah, so in all these, the nobles and monarchy, they enjoyed their pomp and luxury, and France was quite famous for the pomp and pageantry, which we have spoken about. So the hungry peasants of France, they were asked to eat grass by a governor, and there were millions of professional beggars in France around that time. I mean, they did begging for a profession because nothing else to do. Anyway, so this is what I think, this is what I put myself in the shoes, and like, think about a generation which had witnessed their mothers, sisters and grandmothers burnt at stake.
For sure.
Yeah. A generation that was forced into becoming professional beggars.
Yeah.
The only explanation provided for all this mystery was, it's either war or religion, or war based on religion or whatever. So their sufferings being rewarded in another world and afterlife was another explanation. So that came from the religion. So the rulers, I think, were begging for a revolution. In more colloquial terms, they were gagging for it. And they were gagging for their heads to be cut off. And sadly it happened, but it didn't end there. So my question is, when it started, did the European thought change at some point? Yes. How did it change? More of that in the next episode. Until then, cheers.